Sister Esperanza Morales pressed her trembling hand against her growing belly as she stood at the edge of the New Mexico desert, knowing that the child she carried would either be her salvation or her damnation, and that somewhere in the vast wilderness ahead, a Navajo warrior named Hestian Bentley would soon make a vow that would change both their destinies forever. The adobe walls of Mission San Rafael had never felt more like a prison than they did on this scorching July morning in 1878. Sister Esperanza clutched the rough wooden cross that hung from her neck, its familiar weight now feeling like an anchor, dragging her deeper into an ocean of impossible choices. Behind those sacred walls lay 7 years of devoted service to God, a life of prayer and selfless dedication to the orphaned children who had found refuge in the mission's protective embrace. But beneath her coarse brown habit, a secret grew that would shatter everything she had sworn to uphold.
Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you.
The child she carried was not conceived in sin, as the world would surely believe, but in a love so pure and desperate that it had transcended every barrier between two peoples who were supposed to be enemies. The father was not some wandering traitor or corrupt priest, but a man whose very existence challenged everything the church taught about salvation and the souls of the indigenous peoples. 4 months had passed since she first felt the flutter of life within her womb. 4 months of morning sickness disguised as fasting, of loose-fitting robes hiding the subtle changes in her body, of sleepless nights wrestling with the knowledge that discovery would mean not just her own destruction, but the end of everything the mission had built in this hostile frontier territory. The other sisters had begun to notice her pallor, her frequent absences from morning prayers, the way she sometimes pressed her hand to her stomach with an expression they couldn't quite interpret. Mother Superior Angeles had been watching her with increasingly sharp eyes, the elderly woman's decades of experience with young novices making her sensitive to the signs of spiritual crisis or physical ailment. Just yesterday, she had summoned Esperanza to her austere office, where crucifixes and portraits of saints gazed down with expressions of eternal judgment, and asked pointed questions about her health and her commitment to her sacred vows. The mission sat like a fortress of faith in the high desert country of northern New Mexico, its thick walls and heavy wooden doors designed to protect the nuns and their charges from Apache raids, bandits, and the harsh realities of frontier life. Beyond its walls stretched an endless expanse of red rock canyons, sage-covered mesas, and hidden valleys where the Navajo people had lived for countless generations before the Spanish missionaries arrived with their promises of salvation and their demands for conversion. It was in one of those hidden valleys that Esperanza had first encountered Hestian Bentley, though she had known him then by his Christian name of Miguel, the identity he had adopted when he occasionally visited the mission to trade horses and gather information about the movements of American soldiers. He was a man caught between two worlds, fluent in Spanish and English, as well as his native Dine Bizad, educated in the ways of both his traditional people and the encroaching white civilization that threatened to destroy everything his ancestors had built. Their first meeting had been entirely innocent, a chance encounter when Esperanza was gathering medicinal herbs in the foothills beyond the mission's vegetable gardens. She had been kneeling beside a stream, collecting the purple flowers of the bee balm plant that Sister Remedios used to treat the fevers that often struck the orphaned children, when she heard the soft nickering of a horse and looked up to see a man watching her from across the narrow creek. He was unlike any man she had ever seen, tall and lean with the weathered skin of someone who lived entirely outdoors, his long black hair bound with strips of leather and adorned with small silver ornaments that caught the desert sunlight. His clothes were a mixture of traditional Navajo weaving and practical frontier gear, deerskin leggings and a cotton shirt topped with a vest of deep blue wool decorated with intricate patterns that seemed to tell stories in their geometric designs. What struck her most powerfully was not his appearance, but the quality of stillness that surrounded him, a sense of being completely at home in the natural world that made him seem like a natural extension of the landscape itself. When their eyes met across the water, she felt something shift inside her chest, a recognition that went deeper than rational thought and touched something primitive and fundamental in her soul. "Sister," he said in carefully accented Spanish, inclining his head with the formal courtesy that marked his interactions with the religious community. "I did not mean to disturb your work. I was watering my horses and saw you there. These are dangerous times to be alone so far from the mission walls." Esperanza rose slowly, the basket of herbs clutched in her hands as she struggled to find her voice. Everything about this encounter violated the rules that governed her. Life as a religious sister, from speaking privately with a man to venturing so far from the mission's protective boundaries. Yet something about his presence made her feel safer rather than more vulnerable, as if his watchful attention was a form of protection rather than a threat. "I come here often to gather medicines for the children," she replied, her voice steadier than she had expected. "The plants that grow wild in these hills are often more potent than anything we can cultivate in our gardens. I know the risks, but sometimes necessity outweighs caution." He nodded with understanding that suggested familiarity with the healing properties of desert plants. "My grandmother was a medicine woman. She taught me to recognize the plants that heal and those that harm. The bee balm you are gathering is good for fevers, but the white sage that grows on the slope behind you is better for respiratory ailments. The children in your mission suffer much from the lung sickness, do they not?" The conversation that followed lasted barely 10 minutes, but it established a connection that would prove impossible to sever. Hastian shared knowledge of medicinal plants that could help the sickly children in her care, while she described the daily struggles of maintaining health and hope in an institution that was perpetually short of supplies and medical expertise. When he finally rode away, disappearing into the maze of arroyos and rock formations that made up the surrounding landscape, Esperanza knew that her life had been fundamentally altered by their brief encounter. Over the following weeks, their meetings became a carefully orchestrated dance of accidental encounters and shared purposes. Hastian would appear when she was gathering herbs, always approaching with the same formal courtesy but staying to share knowledge that proved invaluable to her work with the mission's children. He taught her to identify plants she had never noticed, showed her how to prepare medicines that were more effective than anything in the mission's limited medical supplies, and gradually revealed the depth of traditional knowledge that his people had accumulated over centuries of desert survival. What began as exchanges of practical information slowly evolved into conversations about larger questions of faith, culture, and the collision between different ways of understanding the world. Hastian spoke of his people's spiritual traditions with the same reverence that Esperanza brought to her Catholic beliefs, describing a relationship with the natural world that seemed to encompass everything her own faith taught about the presence of the divine in creation. "Your God and my holy people are not so different," he said during one of their conversations beside the creek that had become their regular meeting place. "Both teach that there is something sacred in all life, that we are responsible for caring for those who cannot care for themselves, that the greatest strength comes from serving something larger than our own desires." Esperanza found herself challenged by ideas that had never been presented in her religious education, forced to examine assumptions about salvation and spiritual truth that she had never questioned. The church taught that Hastian's people were heathens in need of conversion, souls lost in darkness who could only be saved through acceptance of Christian doctrine. Yet the man who sat across from her demonstrated a spiritual depth and moral commitment that seemed to embody the very virtues her faith claimed to promote. Their relationship deepened through the long summer months of 1877, moving from intellectual exchange to emotional intimacy with an inevitability that terrified and exhilarated Esperanza in equal measure.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story.
She began looking forward to their meetings with an anticipation that had nothing to do with her work at the mission and everything to do with the way Hastian's presence made her feel truly seen and understood for the first time in her adult life. The transformation was subtle but profound. Where once she had found purpose and fulfillment in her religious duties, now those same activities felt hollow and mechanical compared to the vibrancy she experienced during her conversations with Hastian. The prayers that had once lifted her spirit now seemed like empty recitations, while the simple act of discussing desert plants with a Navajo warrior filled her with a sense of connection to something vast and meaningful. The physical attraction that developed between them was undeniable but complicated by the impossibility of their circumstances. Esperanza had taken sacred vows of chastity that bound her not just to God, but to a community that depended on her. Dedication and service. Hastian carried the responsibility of protecting his people during one of the most dangerous periods in their history, when American military forces were systematically destroying Navajo communities and forcing survivors onto distant reservations. Yet despite every rational argument against pursuing their feelings, the connection between them continued to strengthen. Their conversations grew more personal, their shared silences more intimate, their accidental touches more frequent and lingering. When autumn arrived and the desert began to cool from the brutal heat of summer, they both understood that their relationship had moved far beyond the boundaries of acceptable interaction between a Catholic nun and a Navajo warrior. The first time he kissed her was during an October evening when the setting sun painted the desert rocks in shades of gold and crimson that seemed to set the entire world on fire. They had been discussing the migration patterns of birds, a conversation that had grown into a meditation on freedom and the courage required to leave familiar places in search of something better. Sometimes I envy the birds their ability to simply fly away when circumstances become unbearable, Esperanza had said, watching a hawk circle high above the canyon walls. They are not bound by vows or expectations, or the weight of other people's needs, but they are bound by the seasons and the availability of food, and the instincts that drive them to return to the same nesting places year after year. Hastian replied, "Freedom is not the absence of all constraints, but the wisdom to know which constraints serve life and which serve only fear." When she turned to look at him, struck by the truth of his observation, she found him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. The space between them seemed to crackle with unspoken possibilities, and when he reached out to touch her face with gentle fingers, she made no move to pull away. The kiss was tender and reverent, as if he understood the magnitude of what she was risking by allowing this moment of intimacy. When they finally broke apart, both were trembling with the knowledge that they had crossed a line from which there could be no return. Everything about their relationship would be different now, weighted with the power of acknowledged desire and the impossibility of its fulfillment. "This cannot be," Esperanza whispered, though she made no move to step away from his embrace. "I have given my life to God. I have sworn sacred vows that I cannot break without damning my immortal soul, and I have responsibilities to my people that require me to remain free of attachments that could compromise my judgment." Hastian replied, his voice heavy with regret. "But knowing that something is impossible does not make it any less real or any less precious." What followed was a courtship conducted in the shadows of duty and faith, a love affair that violated every rule that governed both their lives yet felt more sacred than any ceremony either had ever witnessed. They met in secret places known only to them, shared conversations that lasted until the stars appeared in the desert sky, and gradually acknowledged that their feelings had grown beyond anything that could be contained by rational decision or moral prohibition. The physical consummation of their relationship came during the winter months, when the desert cold drove them to seek shelter in a hidden, cave that Hastian knew from his childhood explorations of the canyon country. What began as protection from a sudden snowstorm became a sanctuary where they could express their love without fear of discovery or judgment. Esperanza had never experienced physical intimacy before, had barely understood the mechanics of human sexuality beyond the warnings about temptation that filled her religious education. But in Hastian's arms, she discovered that the body could be a vehicle for spiritual connection as profound as any prayer or meditation. Their lovemaking was reverent and patient, an exploration of intimacy that honored both their innocence and their innocence. Their deep emotional bond. "This is not sin," Hastian whispered as they lay together in the warmth of their shared blankets, watching firelight dance on the cave walls. "What we have created together is too beautiful, too sacred to be condemned by any human authority. The holy people do not punish love that serves life and brings joy to the world." Esperanza wanted to believe him, needed to believe that their love was a blessing rather than a curse, but the weight of her religious training made it impossible to silence the voice of conscience that warned of eternal damnation for her violations of sacred vows. She had been taught that the body was a source of temptation, that sexual desire was a weakness to be overcome rather than a gift to be celebrated. Yet lying in Hastian's arms, feeling more complete and at peace than she had ever felt in 7 years of religious devotion, it was impossible to believe that something so beautiful could be fundamentally evil. The connection between them seemed to transcend physical pleasure, creating a unity of spirit that made her previous understanding of divine love seem shallow and incomplete. Their secret relationship continued through the winter and into the early spring of 1878, a period of happiness that both treasured even as they understood its fragility. They made no plans for the future, spoke no words of permanent commitment, simply existed in the precious present of shared love and mutual understanding. The end of their brief paradise came not through discovery or guilt, but through the larger forces of history that were reshaping the entire Southwest. Word reached the mission that American military forces were preparing a final campaign against the remaining free Navajo bands, a coordinated effort to capture or kill every native person who had refused to relocate to the reservation at Bosque Redondo. Hastian's people were among those targeted for elimination, scattered families and small bands who had managed to avoid previous military sweeps by hiding in the most inaccessible parts of the canyon country. As one of their most skilled warriors and scouts, Hastian would be a particular prize for the soldiers, and his capture would significantly weaken his people's ability to evade the military dragnet that was closing around them. "I have to leave," he told Esperanza during what they both understood would be their final meeting at the hidden cave. "My people are gathering for a last stand in the mountains to the north. If we cannot find a way to negotiate a peace that allows us to remain on our traditional lands, we will at least die fighting rather than waste away on a reservation designed to destroy everything that makes us who we are." Esperanza felt her world collapsing around her as she absorbed the implications of his words. Not only was she losing the man she loved, but she was facing the possibility that he would die in the coming conflict, another casualty of the relentless expansion of American civilization into native territories. "Take me with you," she pleaded, knowing even as she spoke that the request was impossible. "I cannot bear to lose you now, not when we have found something so precious and rare." "You know I cannot," Hastian replied gently, holding her close as she wept against his chest. "You would be a liability to my people, a target that would draw attention and endanger everyone around you. And you have responsibilities here, children who depend on your care and knowledge." It was during their farewell that Esperanza first suspected she might be carrying his child. The signs were subtle, a missed monthly cycle that she had attributed to stress, a sensitivity to certain foods that had made her avoid the mission's dining hall, a fatigue that went deeper than simple exhaustion. But as Hastian held her for what might be the last time, She felt a flutter of movement in her abdomen that could only mean one thing. She said nothing to him about her suspicions, understanding that knowledge of a pregnancy would only make their separation more agonizing for both of them. Instead, she memorized every detail of his face, every word of their final conversation, every sensation of being held by the man who had shown her what love could be, when it transcended all the barriers that human society created to keep people apart. When Hastien rode away that night, disappearing into the darkness with the silence and swiftness that marked all his movements, Esperanza understood that her life had reached a crossroads from which there could be no return. If her suspicions about the pregnancy proved correct, she would soon face choices that would test every aspect of her faith, her courage, and her commitment to the life she had built within the mission's protective walls. The confirmation came 2 weeks later, when she could no longer deny the physical changes in her body, or the morning sickness that made it impossible to hide her condition much longer. She was carrying Hastien's child, a living symbol of their forbidden love, and a scandal that would destroy not just her own life but potentially the entire mission community that depended on the church's continued support. Standing now at the edge of the desert with her few possessions wrapped in a bundle, Sister Esperanza Morales prepared to make the most difficult decision of her life, knowing that somewhere in the vast wilderness ahead, the father of her unborn child was fighting a war that would determine the fate of his entire people. The scorching sun had climbed high above the red rock mesas when Esperanza's strength finally gave out, forcing her to seek shelter beneath a twisted juniper tree that offered the only shade for miles in any direction. Her feet, accustomed only to the smooth stone floors of the mission, were bleeding through the thin leather of her worn shoes, and the coarse fabric of her habit clung to her sweat-soaked skin like a suffocating shroud. 3 days had passed since she fled Mission San Rafael in the pre-dawn darkness, carrying nothing but a small bundle of food, a water gourd, and the desperate hope that she could somehow reach the trading post at Copper Canyon before her condition became obvious to anyone who might recognize her as a runaway nun. The journey that should have taken an experienced traveler 2 days on horseback was stretching into a week-long ordeal for a woman on foot who had never ventured more than a few miles from the mission's protective walls. The desert was proving to be a merciless teacher, indifferent to her religious devotion or her desperate circumstances. During the blazing heat of midday, the sun turned the rocky landscape into a furnace that sapped her strength with every labored breath. At night, the temperature plummeted so dramatically that she shivered uncontrollably despite wrapping herself in every piece of clothing she possessed, while the howls of coyotes and the rustle of unseen creatures reminded her constantly of her vulnerability. Her water was nearly gone, the precious liquid in her gourd reduced to barely enough for another day if she rationed it carefully. The food she had brought from the mission's kitchen had spoiled in the heat, leaving her with nothing but a few pieces of hardtack that crumbled to dust in her mouth and provided little nourishment for someone carrying a child. The morning sickness that had plagued her for weeks had intensified under the stress of her flight, making it difficult to keep down even the small amounts of food and water her body desperately needed. As she rested in the meager shade, Esperanza pressed her hands to her still flat belly and whispered a prayer for the life growing within her. The child she carried was innocent of the circumstances that had brought it into existence, deserving of protection and love regardless of the scandal its birth would create. Whatever happened to her in this unforgiving wilderness, she was determined to survive long enough to give her baby a chance at life. The sound of approaching horses broke through her fevered prayers, causing her to scramble deeper into the shadows beneath the juniper tree. Through the shimmering heat waves that rose from the desert floor, she could see a small group of riders moving across the landscape with the easy confidence of people who belonged in this harsh environment. Her heart raced with fear as she recognized the possibility that these might be soldiers searching for fleeing Navajo, or worse, bounty hunters who made their living capturing runaway women. and returning them to the authorities for reward money. But as the riders drew closer, Esperanza realized with a mixture of relief and terror that the lead horseman was unmistakably familiar. Even at a distance, she recognized the proud bearing and distinctive silhouette of Hastian Bentley, though he looked different now than during their secret meetings near the mission. Gone were the mixed clothing and careful grooming that had marked his visits to trade with the Spanish settlers. Instead, he wore the full regalia of a Navajo warrior, his chest decorated with turquoise and silver, his long hair adorned with eagle feathers that marked his status among his people. With him rode 3 other men, all clearly warriors from their bearing and equipment, though their faces were painted with symbols that Esperanza didn't recognize. Their horses were magnificent animals, well-trained and obviously cherished, moving across the rocky terrain with a sure-footedness that spoke of generations of breeding for desert survival. Each man carried weapons that included both traditional items like war clubs and modern firearms that they had undoubtedly acquired through trade or captured from their enemies. Esperanza's first instinct was to remain hidden, understanding that her presence would create complications for Hastian at a time when he needed to focus entirely on protecting his people from the military campaign that was closing in around them. But her weakened condition made concealment impossible, and when one of the horses shied at her scent, all 4 riders turned in her direction with the instant alertness of men accustomed to danger. "There is someone hiding beneath that tree," said one of the warriors in heavily accented English, his hand moving to the rifle secured to his saddle. "Could be a scout for the blue coats or someone trying to set a trap." Hastian raised his hand for silence, his sharp eyes scanning the shadows until they found Esperanza's huddled form. The shock that crossed his features was quickly replaced by concern and then by a fierce protectiveness that transformed his entire demeanor from cautious warrior to devoted protector. "Esperanza," he said, dismounting and approaching her hiding place with careful movements designed not to startle her further. "What are you doing out here alone? The desert is no place for someone unused to its dangers, especially not now when soldiers patrol these lands looking for any excuse to kill." She emerged from the shadows on unsteady legs, her appearance shocking even to men who were accustomed to the hardships of frontier life. Her habit was torn and stained with dust and perspiration, her face burned by the relentless sun, her lips cracked and bleeding from dehydration. But it was the obvious desperation in her eyes that moved Hastian to immediate action, catching her as she swayed and threatening to collapse. "I had to leave the mission," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't stay any longer. There are things you don't know, circumstances that made it impossible for me to remain behind those walls." The other warriors had dismounted as well, forming a protective circle around their leader and the strange woman he was supporting. Esperanza could see the questions in their faces, the suspicion that any Spanish woman might be connected to their enemies, but also the respect they showed for Hastian's obvious concern for her welfare. "This is the woman I told you about," Hastian said to his companions in rapid Navajo, his words carrying an authority that forestalled any objections they might have raised. "She is under my protection now, and anyone who harms her will answer to me personally." The eldest of the 3 warriors, a man whose weathered face and multiple scars marked him as a veteran of many battles, studied Esperanza with eyes that seemed to see everything. When he spoke, his English was surprisingly fluent, marked by the formal cadence of someone who had learned the language through careful study rather than casual conversation. "You are the sister from the Spanish mission, the one who knows the healing plants," he said. "My nephew has spoken of you, of your kindness to the children and your respect for the old ways of medicine. But why are you here in the desert, alone and clearly unprepared for such a journey?" Esperanza looked from the elder warrior to Hastian, realizing that she would have to reveal her secret to these men if she hoped to gain their protection and assistance. The thought of speaking about her pregnancy to strangers was mortifying, but her desperate circumstances left her no choice but to trust in their honor and Hestian's influence over them. "I am carrying a child," she said quietly, the words seeming to hang in the desert air like a physical presence. "The father is a good man, but our love was forbidden by the laws of both our peoples. I could not remain at the mission where discovery would bring scandal and punishment, not just to me, but to everyone who had offered me shelter and friendship." The silence that followed her confession stretched for what felt like hours, though. It was probably only moments. Esperanza watched Hestian's face as he absorbed the implications of her words, seeing the progression from surprise to understanding to a fierce joy that he tried to conceal from his companions. "The child is mine," Hestian said finally, his voice carrying a pride and protectiveness that left no room for doubt or discussion. "This woman carries my son or daughter, and she is therefore under the protection of my clan and my people. Anyone who would harm her must first kill me." The elder warrior nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful rather than judgmental. "A child is always a blessing, regardless of the circumstances of its creation. But this situation is complicated by the war that surrounds us. The Bluecoats show no mercy to Navajo women and children, and they would certainly kill a Spanish woman who travels with our warriors." The practical implications of her situation began to sink in as Esperanza listened to the men discuss her fate in voices that mixed concern with tactical considerations. She was a liability to these warriors who were fighting for the survival of their entire people, a burden that could slow them down or compromise their ability to evade the military forces that were hunting them. At the same time, her condition made it impossible for her to continue traveling alone through the desert without almost certain death. "There's a place," said one of the younger warriors, a man whose keen eyes and quiet manner suggested he served as a scout for the group. "My grandmother's sister lives in a hidden canyon 3 days' ride to the north. She has taken in other women who needed shelter from the war, and she knows the old ways of helping mothers through difficult births." Hestian considered this suggestion while studying Esperanza's exhausted condition. "Can you ride?" he asked gently. "We cannot slow our pace significantly, but we can ensure that you reach safety before we continue on to join the main body of our forces." The prospect of riding for 3 days in her weakened state seemed nearly impossible, but Esperanza understood that it represented her only chance of survival. "I will do whatever is necessary to protect my child," she said, summoning reserves of strength she didn't know she possessed. "I may not be experienced in desert travel, but I am stronger than I appear." What followed was a crash course in frontier survival as the warriors shared their knowledge and equipment to give Esperanza the best possible chance of completing the journey. They gave her water from their own supplies, food that would be easier for her to digest, and clothing more suitable for desert travel. Most importantly, they provided her with a gentle mare who had been trained to carry wounded warriors, a patient animal who would respond to her inexperienced handling without creating additional danger. The transformation from mission nun to desert traveler required more than just changing clothes and learning to ride. Esperanza had to adopt an entirely different way of moving through the world, alert to dangers that she had never imagined and dependent on skills that were completely foreign to her religious education. The men taught her to read the signs of weather in the desert sky, to recognize the plants that could provide water or nutrition in an emergency, and to remain silent and still when threats appeared on the horizon. As they traveled deeper into the canyon country that the Navajo had used as refuge for generations, Esperanza began to understand the profound connection between these people and the land they inhabited. Every rock formation had a name and a story. Every plant had multiple uses that had been passed down through countless generations. Every animal track told a story about the movement of life through this seemingly barren landscape. Your people see the desert as empty space between the places that matter, Hestian explained as they rode through a narrow canyon where ancient petroglyphs decorated the walls. But for us, this is home in the deepest sense. Every stone, every spring, Every mesa top has significance in our history and our spiritual understanding of the world. The journey also provided opportunities for private conversation between Esperanza and Hastian, precious moments when the constraints of their different worlds seemed less important than the love they shared and the child they had created together. Riding side by side through landscapes of incredible beauty and harsh challenge, they began to envision possibilities for their future that neither had dared to imagine during their secret meetings near the mission. "When this war is over," Hastian said during one of their evening camps, "when my people have found safety and the soldiers have given up their pursuit, perhaps we can build something together that honors both our traditions and our love." Esperanza wanted to believe in such possibilities, but her practical understanding of the world made her doubtful about the chances for peace between their peoples. The American military campaign was designed not just to relocate the Navajo, but to destroy their culture and their connection to their traditional lands. Even if some individuals survived the immediate conflict, the life they had known for generations was ending forever. "What kind of world will our child inherit?" she asked, watching the stars appear in the vast desert sky. "Will there be room for someone who carries the blood of both Spanish and Navajo peoples? Or will they be forever caught between worlds that cannot accept their mixed heritage?" Question haunted both of them as they traveled deeper into the hidden places where Hastian's people had taken refuge. Around every bend in the trail, they might encounter evidence of the destruction that was sweeping across the southwest. Burned hogans and scattered belongings that marked the passage of military expeditions or the desperate flight of families. Ahead of the advancing soldiers, on the final day of their journey to the hidden canyon, they encountered a group of refugees that included women and children who had been traveling for weeks in search of safety. The sight of these displaced families, carrying everything they owned in small bundles and driving a few precious livestock ahead of them, brought home the reality of what the war meant for ordinary people caught in its path. Among the refugees was an elderly woman whose granddaughter was about to give birth under the most difficult possible circumstances. The young mother had been in labor for 2 days without making progress, and the other women were beginning to fear for both her life and that of her unborn child. When they learned that Esperanza had knowledge of healing and midwifery, they begged for her help in a situation that was growing more desperate by the hour. Working with traditional Navajo midwives who possessed knowledge passed down through generations of women, Esperanza drew on everything she had learned about childbirth from her work at the mission's infirmary. The successful delivery of a healthy baby boy in the middle of a refugee camp, surrounded by the constant threat of military pursuit, became a moment of hope and celebration that briefly overshadowed the larger tragedy unfolding around them. "You have the gift of bringing life into the world even in the darkest of times," the baby's grandmother said to Esperanza as she held her new grandson. "This is a sacred ability that marks you as someone chosen by the holy people to serve life itself." The experience of helping to deliver a Navajo baby while carrying her own mixed heritage child created a profound shift in Esperanza's understanding of her place in the world. No longer was she simply a Spanish nun who had fallen in love with a Navajo warrior, but a woman whose skills and compassion could serve as a bridge between different peoples during a time of terrible conflict. When they finally reached the hidden canyon where Hastian's great-aunt maintained a refuge for displaced women and children, Esperanza found herself in a community unlike anything she had ever experienced. Here, traditional Navajo ways of life continued despite the war raging in the outside world, with women maintaining the arts of weaving and pottery while men hunted and stood guard against potential threats. The woman who would become her protector and teacher was called Aziza Nadli by her people, a name that honored her wisdom and her ability to guide women through the challenges of motherhood and healing. She was ancient by the standards of frontier life, probably in her 70s, but her eyes remained sharp and her hands steady as she examined Esperanza and assessed her condition. "This child you carry will be special," she said after completing Her examination, speaking in English that was flavored with the rhythms of her native language. Mixed-blood children often receive gifts from both sides of their heritage, becoming bridges between worlds that seem impossibly separate. But such children also face challenges that require special protection and guidance. As Hastian prepared to leave the hidden canyon to rejoin his warriors, he made a vow that would echo through the remaining chapters of their story. Taking Esperanza's hands in his own, he spoke words that carried the weight of sacred promise. "I swear by the holy people, and by the love we share, that I will return for you and our child. No matter what trials await me in the battles ahead, no matter what obstacles arise between us, I will find a way to create a life where we can be together as a family. This is my vow to you, and I will keep it even if it costs me everything I have." Standing in the hidden canyon as Hastian rode away to face an uncertain destiny, Esperanza realized that her journey was far from over, and that the greatest challenges still lay ahead. The screams that shattered the pre-dawn silence of the hidden canyon would haunt Esperanza for the rest of her life, a sound that transformed her sanctuary into a battlefield in the space of a single heartbeat. She had been grinding corn with the other women, her hands moving in the ancient rhythm that Asa Nadli had taught her, when the first gunshots echoed off the canyon walls like thunder trapped in stone. Colonel Marcus Thornfield of the 7th Cavalry had discovered their refuge through methods that spoke of betrayal from within their own ranks, leading 2 companies of hardened Indian fighters into the maze of canyons that the Navajo had considered impregnable. His reputation for brutality preceded him across the entire Southwest, a man who had built his military career on the systematic destruction of native communities, and who saw the extermination of indigenous peoples as both a patriotic duty and a personal calling. The attack came without warning and without mercy, soldiers pouring into the canyon from 3 different directions, while their Crow Scouts blocked the escape routes that might have allowed the women and children to flee into the deeper wilderness. These were not the typical military raids designed to capture prisoners for relocation, but a deliberate massacre, intended to send a message that no place would remain safe for those who refused to submit to American authority. Esperanza found herself thrust into a nightmare beyond anything her sheltered religious life had prepared her to face, watching in horror as soldiers systematically murdered elderly men who posed no threat to anyone and shot down women who were trying to protect their children. The careful order of the hidden community dissolved into chaos as people scattered in desperate search of cover or escape routes that no longer existed. "Stay close to me," Asa Nadli had commanded, grabbing Esperanza's arm with surprising strength for someone of her advanced age. "There is a cave behind the waterfall where we can hide until this madness passes. But we must move quickly before they discover the path." The journey to the hidden cave required them to cross open ground where bullets whined overhead and ricocheted off stone walls with deadly unpredictability. Esperanza pressed her hands protectively over her growing belly as they ran, terrified that her unborn child would die before ever drawing breath in a world that seemed determined to destroy anything beautiful or innocent. Behind them, the sounds of slaughter continued with mechanical efficiency that spoke of soldiers who had performed the same brutal task in countless other locations. Colonel Thornfield's voice could be heard above the gunfire, shouting orders to his men to take no prisoners and to burn everything that might provide shelter or sustenance to any survivors who might escape into the surrounding wilderness. The cave behind the waterfall proved to be more than just a hiding place, but an ancient ceremonial site where generations of Navajo women had come to pray for protection during times of crisis. The walls were decorated with pictographs that told stories of survival and renewal, while natural formations in the rock created spaces where sacred objects had been hidden for safekeeping during previous conflicts. "My grandmother brought me here when I was a young woman," Asa Nadlihi whispered as they huddled in the darkness, listening to the terrible sounds echoing from the canyon beyond. "She told me that this place holds the power to protect those who carry life within them. that the holy people would not allow mothers and unborn children to be destroyed by the hatred of men. Other women and children had found their way to the same refuge, creating a small community of survivors who clung to each other for comfort while the massacre continued outside. Among them was the young mother whose baby Esperanza had helped deliver during their journey to the canyon, clutching her infant son as if her embrace alone could shield him from the violence that surrounded them. The waiting was the worst part, sitting in darkness while the sounds of destruction gradually faded into an ominous silence that was somehow more terrifying than the gunfire had been. When Colonel Thornfield's men finally departed, they left behind a scene of devastation that would scar the memory of everyone who witnessed it, a testament to the depths of cruelty that human beings could inflict upon each other in the name of progress and civilization. Emerging from their hiding place after hours of terrified waiting, the survivors found their peaceful community transformed into a smoking ruin where bodies lay, scattered among the destroyed remnants of homes and possessions. The soldiers had been thorough in their destruction, burning food stores and destroying water sources in an effort to ensure that no one could return to rebuild what had been lost. 23 dead, reported one of the few men who had survived. By hiding in the rocks above the canyon floor, including Azza Nadlihi's brother and 2 of the children who were too young to understand the need for silence. The soldiers took nothing of value, killed livestock they could not carry, destroyed everything they could not steal. The massacre had been witnessed by scouts from other Navajo bands, word of the atrocity spreading through the remaining free communities like wildfire carried by desert winds. Among those who received the devastating news was Hastian Benelli, who learned of the attack while preparing for a raid against an army supply convoy 30 miles to the south. The rage that consumed Hastian when he heard about the destruction of the hidden canyon was unlike anything his fellow warriors had ever seen in him, a fury that transformed his careful strategic thinking into something primal and dangerous. The knowledge that Esperanza had been in the canyon during the attack, that she might have been among the victims of Colonel Thornfield's butchery, awakened something savage in his normally controlled nature. "I am going back," he announced to his war party, his voice carrying a finality that warned against argument or discussion. "The woman who carries my child was in that canyon when the Bluecoats attacked. I will find her, and I will make the soldiers pay for what they have done to our people." His cousin and closest friend, a warrior named Daib Yatsi, attempted to dissuade him from what seemed like a suicidal mission. "The canyon will be watched now, and Thornfield's men will be expecting retaliation. You cannot help the dead by joining them, and your people need your leadership more than they need your revenge." But Hastian's decision had been made with the absolute conviction of a man who understood that some losses were more than flesh and blood could bear. Whether Esperanza lived or died, whether their child would ever draw breath in this world, he would not abandon them to face their fate alone while he pursued military objectives that had suddenly become meaningless compared to the welfare of his family. The journey back to the hidden canyon took him through territory that was now crawling with military patrols, forcing him to use every skill he had learned during years of warfare against the American expansion into Navajo lands. Moving by night and hiding during the day, living on minimal food and water while pushing his horse to the limits of endurance, he covered ground that normally required 3 days of travel in barely 36 hours. What he found when he finally reached the canyon was worse than his darkest fears had prepared him to face. The scale of destruction was absolute, every structure reduced to charred ruins, every sign of life and prosperity systematically eliminated by men who had turned killing into a precise military science. The bodies had been left where they fell, a deliberate insult designed to prevent proper burial and to terrorize any survivors who might return. "Esperanza," he called out, his voice echoing off canyon walls that had once sheltered the woman he loved. "If you are alive, if you can hear me, please answer. I have come back as I promised. I have come to take you away from this place of death. The response came not from Esperanza herself, but from Ned, who emerged from the cave. Behind the waterfall, like a ghost returning from the land of the dead. Her ancient face was marked with grief and exhaustion, but her eyes held the unbreakable strength of someone who had witnessed too much tragedy to be destroyed by any single loss. "She is alive," the old woman said without preamble, understanding that Hastian's desperate journey had been motivated by love rather than duty. "The mother of your child lives, though she has been changed by what she witnessed here. She has seen what your enemies are capable of, and the knowledge has awakened something dangerous in her spirit." Esperanza herself appeared moments later, and Hastian was shocked by the transformation that the massacre had wrought in her appearance and demeanor. Gone was the gentle nun who had tended medicinal plants near the mission, replaced by a woman whose eyes held the hard light of someone who had looked directly into the face of evil and refused to be broken by what she saw. Her pregnancy was now obvious despite her efforts to conceal it, her body having changed dramatically during the weeks of stress and inadequate nutrition that had followed her flight from the mission. But more significant than her physical condition was the aura of determined fury that surrounded her like heat rising from desert stones, an anger that burned with the intensity of religious conviction, turned toward violent purposes. "I helped bury children," she said without greeting or explanation, her voice carrying undertones that Hastian had never heard before. "Children who died because men like Colonel Thornfield believe that some human beings are less valuable than others. I held mothers while they wept over babies who had been shot down like animals, and I made promises to the dying that I intend to keep." The promises she spoke of had been made during the long night of caring for the wounded and preparing the dead for burial, vows that transformed her understanding of Christian duty from passive acceptance of divine will to active resistance against human evil. Working alongside Navajo women who had lost everything they cherished, she had discovered that love could be expressed through violence when all other options had been exhausted. "What kind of promises?" Hastian asked, though he could see the answer in her eyes and in the way she held herself like a weapon rather than a woman seeking protection. "I promised them that Colonel Thornfield would pay for what he did here," Esperanza replied, her hands moving protectively over her belly where their child grew despite the surrounding destruction. "I promised them that the men who murdered children would not live to repeat their crimes in other places. And I promised them that her child would grow up in a world where such atrocities are not tolerated by those who claim to serve God." The conversation that followed revealed the depth of change that the massacre had created in Esperanza's understanding of her role in the conflict between their peoples. No longer content to remain hidden while others fought and died, she had decided to use her knowledge of Spanish colonial society and her connections within the mission system to gather intelligence that could help the Navajo resistance strike more effectively at their enemies. "I know the supply routes that the army uses to provision their campaigns," she explained, spreading out a hand-drawn map that showed her detailed knowledge of the territory between the Rio Grande and the Colorado River. "I know which traders are sympathetic to the military, and which ones might be persuaded to share information about troop movements and planned operations." More dangerous still was her proposal to return to the Spanish settlements as a supposed refugee from Indian attacks, using her religious credentials and her condition as a pregnant woman to gain access to information that could save Navajo lives and disrupt American military operations. The plan required her to walk back into the world she had fled, risking exposure and arrest while pretending to be someone she was no longer. "This is madness," Hastian protested, recognizing the courage of her proposal while being terrified by its implications for her safety and that of their unborn child. "You would be placing yourself and our baby directly into the hands of people who would show no mercy if they discovered your true loyalties." But Esperanza had moved beyond considerations of personal safety into a realm where the greater good took precedence over individual survival. The massacre had shown her that neutrality was impossible in a conflict where one side was committed to the complete destruction of the other, and her knowledge of both cultures gave her opportunities to influence the outcome that no one else possessed. Our child deserves to be born into a world where different peoples can coexist, she said with finality that brooked no argument. If I do nothing while knowing that I could help prevent future massacres, then I am as guilty as the men who pulled the triggers. My religious vows may be broken, but my commitment to protecting innocent life remains absolute. The intelligence network she proposed to establish would require her to travel between Spanish settlements and hidden Navajo camps, carrying information that could mean the difference between survival and destruction for the scattered bands that continued to resist relocation. It was work that could only be done by someone who belonged to both worlds while being fully accepted by neither. As they made plans for her dangerous mission, Hastian struggled with the knowledge that he was about to send a woman he loved into mortal peril at a time when she should have been resting and preparing for the birth of their child. But he also recognized that Esperanza had been transformed by witnessing the massacre into someone whose courage and determination might actually tip the balance in a war that his people were slowly losing. When this is over, he said, holding her close in the ruins of what had once been their sanctuary. When the killing stops and our child is born, we will find a place where we can live in peace. I swear this to you by everything I hold sacred. Esperanza looked around at the destruction that surrounded them, at the graves of innocent people who had died simply because they existed in the path of American expansion, and made her own vow that would drive everything that followed. There will be no peace until justice is done, she said, her voice carrying the conviction of someone who had found her true calling in the midst of tragedy. And I will make certain that the men responsible for this atrocity face the consequences of their actions, even if it costs me everything I have left to lose. Standing among the ruins of the hidden canyon, united in their determination to fight back against forces that seemed overwhelming, Hastian and Esperanza began planning a campaign of resistance that would test every assumption about love, loyalty, and the prices that human beings were willing to pay for justice. The gambling halls of Albuquerque reeked of tobacco smoke and unwashed bodies when Colonel Marcus Thornfield strode through the batwing doors of the Silver Dollar Saloon, his military bearing and reputation for ruthless efficiency clearing a path through the crowd of drunken cowboys and territorial officials who comprised the establishment's regular clientele. He had come to the territorial capital to collect his bounty for the Canyon Massacre and to receive new orders for the final phase of the Navajo extermination campaign. What he didn't know was that Sister Maria Esperanza sat in the shadows of the saloon's back corner, disguised as a grieving widow in black mourning dress, her pregnancy concealed beneath layers of fabric, while she listened to every word of his boastful recounting of the atrocity he had committed against innocent women and children. Her transformation from fugitive nun to intelligence operative had taken weeks of careful preparation, but now she was exactly where she needed to be to gather the information that could destroy her enemies, the character she had created for. Her infiltration mission was that of Senora Isabella Vasquez, recently widowed when her rancher husband was supposedly killed in an Apache raid near Socorro. The story explained her pregnancy, her need for protection, and her presence in places where a respectable woman would normally never venture. More importantly, it gave her access to conversations between military officers and territorial politicians, who saw her as harmless decoration rather than mortal threat. 23 confirmed dead, Thornfield was telling Governor Samuel Wallace, his voice carrying the satisfaction of a man who took genuine pleasure in describing acts of violence against defenseless people, including the old medicine woman who had been sheltering runaway squaws and their half-breed offspring. We burned everything they couldn't carry and poisoned the water sources to make sure none of them could return. Esperanza forced herself to remain motionless as she listened to the casual discussion of murder and desecration. her hands clenched beneath the table to prevent them from shaking with the rage that threatened to overwhelm her carefully maintained disguise. Every detail Thornfield shared was another piece of evidence that she would carry back to Hastian and his warriors, intelligence that would help them plan their revenge with surgical precision. The information she had already gathered during 3 weeks of operating in Albuquerque was more valuable than anything the Navajo resistance had previously possessed. Troop movements, supply schedules, planned operations against remaining free bands, and most crucially, the personal habits and vulnerabilities of the officers responsible for implementing the extermination policy. She had become a ghost moving through the centers of colonial power, invisible to men who saw her only as a woman in need of their protection and charity. The Washington politicians want this Navajo problem resolved permanently before the railroad expansion begins, Governor Wallace continued, unaware that his words were being memorized by someone who would use them to coordinate the destruction of everything he hoped to accomplish. Too much money at stake to allow a handful of savages to interfere with progress and development. But Esperanza's intelligence gathering had revealed something far more dangerous than military plans or political objectives. Hidden within the casual conversations of drunken officers and corrupt officials was evidence of a conspiracy that reached far beyond the territorial government, connecting local military commanders with powerful Eastern interests who saw the Southwest as a region to be cleared of indigenous peoples and developed for maximum profit. The Silver Dollar Saloon served as an unofficial headquarters for this network of corruption, where contracts for military supplies were negotiated, alongside agreements for the disposal of native lands and resources. Esperanza had documented connections between Colonel Thornfield and Eastern Railroad magnates, between territorial judges and mining companies, between Indian agents and cattle barons who coveted reservation lands for their own purposes. Her pregnancy had progressed to the point where concealment was becoming increasingly difficult, forcing her to modify her surveillance techniques while dealing with the physical challenges of carrying a child during such a dangerous mission. The morning sickness that had plagued her for months had been replaced by fatigue and back pain that made long hours of listening and observation nearly unbearable. The baby's movements had become strong enough to be felt by anyone who held her closely, creating additional risks during the social interactions that were essential to maintaining her cover identity. She had learned to time her public appearances for periods when the child was less active, and to excuse herself from gatherings when the baby's kicks became too obvious to ignore. More challenging still was the emotional toll of maintaining her disguise while listening to detailed descriptions of atrocities committed against people she had come to love and respect. Every casual reference to dead children, every laughing discussion of burned homes and destroyed families, cut into her soul like a blade twisted in a fresh wound. The next phase will target the bands hiding in Canyon de Chelly, Thornfield was explaining to a group of territorial businessmen who were financing the military operations in exchange for future mineral rights. My scouts have identified at least 3 separate groups, maybe 150 Indians total. We'll hit them simultaneously from multiple directions, make sure none of them escape to cause trouble elsewhere. The intelligence Esperanza gathered about the planned Canyon de Chelly operation was exactly what Hastian's coalition of resistance fighters needed to turn the tables on their enemies. But transmitting the information required her to leave Albuquerque and travel through territory that was increasingly dangerous for anyone suspected of Indian sympathies, a journey that would test both her physical endurance and her ability to maintain her false identity under pressure. The contact system she had established with the Navajo resistance involved a network of traders and settlers who had been secretly providing assistance to the indigenous communities despite the personal risks involved. These were people whose moral convictions had led them to oppose the extermination policy, and who were willing to risk their own safety to prevent further massacres. Chief among these secret allies was Father Francisco Morales, an elderly Franciscan priest who operated a small mission church near the village of Barnalillo. Despite sharing a surname with Esperanza's religious identity, he was no relation to her, but his opposition to the military's treatment of native peoples had made him a crucial link in the intelligence chain that connected the colonial settlements with the Navajo resistance. "My child," Father Morales said when Esperanza appeared at his mission church disguised as a penitent seeking spiritual guidance, "you carry more than just a baby in your womb. You carry the hopes of people who have no other voice in the councils of power. But such burdens exact a price that may be higher than you realize." The priest had recognized something in Esperanza that went beyond her carefully constructed widow's identity, seeing through her disguise to the deeper truth of someone whose religious convictions had been tested and transformed by exposure to real evil. His own crisis of faith had come from witnessing the systematic destruction of native communities in the name of Christian civilization. "I have information that could save lives," Esperanza told him, abandoning the pretense of seeking spiritual comfort in favor of direct communication about her mission. "But I need help getting word to people who can act on what I have learned. Time is running short, and many will die if this knowledge doesn't reach them quickly." What followed was a desperate race against time as Father Morales activated his network of contacts to relay Esperanza's intelligence about the planned Canyon de Chelly operation. The information had to travel through a chain of trusted intermediaries, each taking enormous personal risks to ensure that the warning reached Hastings' forces before Thornfield's attack could be launched. The physical and emotional strain of her mission was taking a severe toll on Esperanza's health, threatening both her own survival and that of her unborn child. The constant stress of maintaining her disguise while gathering intelligence had exhausted her reserves of strength, while the psychological impact of listening to discussions about murdering innocent people had pushed her to the edge of breakdown. "You cannot continue this work much longer," Father Morales warned after observing her deteriorating condition. "Your body is telling you that it has reached its limits, and your child will suffer if you ignore those warnings. Sometimes the greatest service we can provide is knowing when to step back and let others carry the burden." But Esperanza had become convinced that her unique position as someone who could move freely between both worlds made her irreplaceable in the fight against the extermination policy. No other person possessed her combination of insider knowledge about colonial society and deep commitment to protecting Navajo lives, and she feared that stepping back would mean abandoning people who depended on the intelligence she could provide. The crisis that forced her to reconsider her role came when she overheard a conversation between Colonel Thornfield and a territorial judge that revealed her cover identity was beginning to attract unwanted attention. Someone had started asking questions about the mysterious widow who seemed to appear wherever sensitive military information was being discussed. "There's something not quite right about that Vasquez woman," Thornfield was saying to Judge Harrison Clark as they shared drinks in the Silver Dollar's private back room. "She asks too many questions, remembers too many details, and her story about how her husband died doesn't match what my scouts reported about that Apache raid near Socorro." The realization that her disguise was compromised sent shockwaves through Esperanza's carefully constructed mission, forcing her to accelerate her intelligence gathering while planning an immediate evacuation from Albuquerque. Every moment she remained in the territorial capital increased the risk of exposure and arrest, but she also knew that information she hadn't yet obtained could mean the difference between life and death for hundreds of Navajo people. The decision to attempt one final intelligence operation, despite the obvious dangers, reflected Esperanza's transformation from careful nun to dedicated warrior in the cause of justice. She had learned that Colonel Thornfield kept detailed maps and operational plans in his quarters at the territorial military headquarters, documents that could provide the Navajo resistance with strategic intelligence for months of future operations. Breaking into a military installation while 7 months pregnant required every skill she had developed during her weeks of covert operations, plus a level of physical courage that pushed her body far beyond what should have been possible in her condition. The baby's movements seemed to intensify during moments of greatest danger, as if the child somehow understood the importance of its mother's mission. The documents she found in Thornfield's quarters were more damaging than anything she had hoped to discover, revealing not just military plans but detailed correspondence with Eastern business interests that proved the extermination campaign was motivated by greed rather than military necessity. Railroad companies, mining corporations, and cattle syndicates had all contributed money to finance the operations in exchange for guaranteed access to native lands after the indigenous populations had been eliminated. Most shocking of all was a letter from Thornfield to his superiors in Washington, boasting about his efficiency in clearing the territory of Indian obstacles to development and requesting a promotion based on his success in implementing the final solution to the Navajo problem. The language was deliberately bureaucratic, but the intent was unmistakably genocidal. Copying the documents by hand while listening for approaching footsteps required concentration that was almost impossible to maintain given her physical condition and the terror of potential discovery. Every sound in the corridor outside made her heart race, while the baby's increasingly active movements made it difficult to hold her hand steady enough to write legibly. The escape from the military headquarters nearly ended in disaster when a patrol of guards almost discovered her climbing through the window she had used to enter Thornfield's quarters. Only her pregnancy saved her from capture, as the guards assumed that no woman in her condition could possibly be involved in espionage activities, but her narrow escape had been observed by someone whose loyalties were more complex than simple military duty. Sergeant Miguel Rodriguez had been watching Colonel Thornfield's quarters as part of his own investigation into corruption within the Territorial Military Command, and he recognized Esperanza as someone whose activities might align with his own objectives. "Senora," he called out softly as she made her way through the shadows toward the headquarters exit. "I know what you were doing in there, and I know why you were doing it. Perhaps we should talk about how we might help each other accomplish goals that serve justice rather than greed." The conversation that followed revealed that Esperanza was not the only person working to undermine the extermination campaign from within the colonial power structure. Sergeant Rodriguez represented a group of soldiers and officers who had become disgusted with their orders to murder civilians, and who were looking for ways to sabotage operations they considered morally unacceptable. "There are more of us than you might think," Rodriguez explained as they found shelter in an abandoned adobe building on the outskirts of Albuquerque. "Good men who joined the army to serve their country, not to participate in the slaughter of women and children. We've been looking for someone with connections to the Indian communities, someone who could help us get information to people who might be able to save lives." The alliance between Esperanza's intelligence network and Rodriguez's group of dissident soldiers opened up possibilities for resistance that neither could have achieved alone. With access to military communications and advance warning of planned operations, they could provide the Navajo forces with strategic advantages that might actually allow them to win engagements against superior numbers and equipment. But the expanded conspiracy also created new vulnerabilities, as more people became aware of the covert operations, and the risks of exposure multiplied with each additional participant. Colonel Thornfield's suspicions about unauthorized activities within his command were growing stronger, and his methods of investigation were becoming increasingly brutal and thorough. The news that changed everything came through Rodriguez's military contacts, information that sent Esperanza racing back toward Navajo territory despite the advanced state of her pregnancy and the obvious dangers of travel through hostile territory. Hastian had been captured during a raid on an army supply convoy, and he was being held at Fort Wingate, pending execution as a war criminal. "They're planning to make an example of him," Rodriguez reported grimly. Public hanging, maximum publicity. Designed to break the spirit of any Indians who might still be thinking about resistance. Thornfield sees this as his chance to end the war by eliminating the most effective native leader, standing at the crossroads of her mission and her personal loyalties. Esperanza realized that all her intelligence gathering and covert operations had led to this moment of ultimate choice. She could continue her valuable work of gathering information and coordinating resistance, or she could risk everything in a desperate attempt to save the man she loved and the father of her unborn child. The iron shackles around Hastian Benelli's wrists had worn bloody grooves in his skin during the 3 weeks of his captivity at Fort Wingate, but his spirit remained unbroken despite the daily beatings and psychological torture that Colonel Thornfield had designed to break him before his scheduled public execution. The wooden gallows that dominated the fort's central parade ground cast long shadows in the early morning light, a constant reminder that his death was intended to serve as both entertainment and warning to any native people who still harbored thoughts of resistance. From his cell in the fort's guardhouse, Hastian could see the preparations being made for what Thornfield called the grand finale of the Navajo pacification campaign, an elaborate spectacle that would include military bands, territorial officials, newspaper reporters, and invited guests from the Eastern business interests who had financed the extermination operations. His execution was being promoted as a celebration of American progress and the triumph of civilization over savagery. What the colonel didn't know was that his prisoner possessed information that could destroy the entire network of corruption and conspiracy that had motivated the genocide campaign. During his weeks of intelligence gathering alongside Esperanza, Hastian had memorized names, dates, financial arrangements, and operational details that could expose the complicity of powerful Eastern interests in crimes against humanity. Torture sessions in Thornfield's private interrogation room had been designed to extract this information, but they had also revealed the depth of the colonel's paranoia about security breaches within his own command structure. Someone was feeding intelligence to the Navajo resistance, someone with access to classified military planning, and Thornfield was becoming increasingly desperate to identify and eliminate the source. "I know there's a spy in my organization," Thornfield had snarled during one particularly brutal questioning session, his fists bloodied from beating his prisoner. "Someone's been passing information to your people, helping them avoid my operations and strike back at supply convoys. You're going to tell me who it is, or I'll make your death last for days instead of minutes." But Hastian's silence had remained absolute, protected by the knowledge that revealing anything about the intelligence network would doom not only Esperanza and her unborn child, but dozens of other people who had risked everything to oppose the extermination campaign. His loyalty to these brave allies was stronger than his fear of pain or death. The guards who supervised his daily exercise periods had begun reporting strange activity in the hills surrounding Fort Wingate, signs that large numbers of armed men were moving through the territory under cover of darkness. Smoke signals had been spotted on distant mesas, and several patrol units had failed to return from routine reconnaissance missions. "Something's building out there," Sergeant Rodriguez had whispered to Hastian during one of his covert visits to the guardhouse, using his authority as a military policeman to gain access to the prisoner. "Your people haven't given up on you, and neither have the allies you've made among the whites. But time is running short, and Thornfield's security measures are getting tighter by the day." The rescue plan that was taking shape in the desert around Fort Wingate was unlike anything that had been attempted during the long years of conflict between the Navajo people and the American military. It required coordination between traditional warriors and their unlikely allies among the dissident soldiers, a level of cooperation that transcended racial and cultural boundaries in service of a shared commitment to justice. Leading the effort was Dave Yahtzee, Hastian's cousin and closest friend, who had spent weeks gathering warriors from scattered bands that had previously operated independently. The prospect of losing their most effective leader to Thornfield's gallows had united the Navajo resistance as nothing else could have achieved, creating a fighting force larger and more determined than any the Americans had faced. But the rescue would require more than military coordination, more than courage and fighting skill, more than the element of surprise that had served the Navajo well in previous engagements. It would require a level of sacrifice that could only come from someone whose love was stronger than their fear of death. Esperanza had arrived at the makeshift war camp hidden in the Zuni Mountains 3 days before the scheduled execution. Her pregnancy now so advanced that travel on horseback had become an ordeal that left her gasping with pain and exhaustion. The baby was due within weeks, possibly days, but she had refused to remain safely hidden while the father of her child faced death at the hands of their enemies. "You should not be here," Dibiatsi had told her bluntly when she appeared at the Warriors' Council meeting, her condition obvious despite her efforts to conceal it beneath loose-fitting clothing. "This is work for fighters, not for women about to give birth. Your presence here endangers not only yourself and your child, but everyone who would feel obligated to protect you during battle." The response that came from Esperanza surprised even those who had witnessed her transformation from gentle nun to determined resistance fighter. Her voice carried an authority that brooked no argument, the conviction of someone who had found her true calling in the crucible of injustice and oppression. "I am not here as someone who needs protection," she said, addressing the assembled warriors with the same intensity she had once brought to religious devotion. "I am here as someone whose knowledge of Fort Wingate's defenses and garrison routines could mean the difference between success and failure. I spent weeks gathering intelligence about that installation, and I know things that no one else in this camp knows." The intelligence she shared with the War Council revealed vulnerabilities in Fort Wingate's security that even Sergeant Rodriguez's insider knowledge hadn't uncovered. Her surveillance during her mission in Albuquerque had included detailed observation of supply schedules, guard rotations, and the personal habits of key officers, information that could be exploited to create opportunities for infiltration and rescue. "The morning execution ceremony will require most of the garrison to be assembled in the parade ground," she explained, sketching a detailed map of the fort's layout from memory. "Security will be focused on the crowd of spectators and the gallows area, leaving the guardhouse relatively undefended. But the timing has to be perfect, and the approach route has to avoid the areas where Thornfield has positioned his sharpshooters." The plan that emerged from hours of intense discussion was audacious to the point of appearing suicidal, requiring simultaneous attacks on multiple targets while creating sufficient chaos to mask the rescue operation itself. Half the warrior force would assault the fort's main gate, drawing attention and forcing the garrison to respond to an obvious threat, while smaller teams infiltrated the compound through weak points that Esperanza had identified, most dangerous. Of all would be the mission to eliminate Colonel Thornfield himself, a task that Esperanza insisted on undertaking, personally despite the obvious risks to her own safety and that of her unborn child. Her insider knowledge of the colonel's daily routine and her ability to move through military installations without attracting suspicion made her uniquely qualified for the assassination, but it also meant placing herself in direct confrontation with the man who had ordered the massacre of innocent families. "This is madness," protested one of the older warriors, a veteran of countless battles who had survived by never taking unnecessary risks. "You speak of walking into the heart of enemy territory while carrying a child that could be born at any moment. Such actions serve emotion rather than strategy, and they endanger everyone involved." But Esperanza's response revealed the spiritual dimension of her commitment, the transformation of her religious convictions into something that transcended traditional concepts of personal safety and rational calculation. She had moved beyond fear into a realm where moral imperatives took precedence over practical considerations. "Some evils are so great that they demand personal confrontation, regardless of the cost," she said, her hands resting protectively on her swollen belly. Colonel Thornfield has murdered children, destroyed families, and perverted the cause of justice into an instrument of greed and hatred. If I do nothing while possessing the ability to stop him, then I am complicit in whatever future atrocities he commits. The night before the assault, Esperanza experienced the first signs that her labor was beginning. Contractions that started as mild discomfort, but gradually intensified into waves of pain that made concentration difficult and movement increasingly challenging. The timing could not have been worse, threatening to incapacitate her during the most crucial phase of the rescue operation. Ned Lee, the ancient medicine woman who had survived the Canyon Massacre, examined Esperanza by firelight and delivered a verdict that filled everyone with concern and admiration in equal measure. The baby was determined to be born during the battle that would determine its father's fate, as if the child somehow understood the significance of the moment and wanted to enter the world at the instant when justice was finally served. This child has the spirit of a warrior, the old woman said, mixing herbs that would help manage the pain while allowing Esperanza to remain functional during the operation. But birthing a baby during battle is not something that should be attempted without accepting that both mother and child may die in the attempt. The conversation that followed between Esperanza and the medicine woman revealed the spiritual dimensions of the choice she was making, the intersection of personal love and universal justice that had driven her beyond the boundaries of conventional wisdom. She understood the risks she was taking, but she also understood that some moments in history required individuals to transcend their personal interests in service of something larger. If my child is born during the battle that saves its father's life, Esperanza said, then it will enter the world at a moment when love has triumphed over hatred, when justice has prevailed over oppression. Such a beginning would be a blessing, regardless of what else happens. The assault on Fort Wingate began at dawn with a coordinated attack that caught the garrison completely off guard, despite their preparations for the execution ceremony. The main gate exploded in a blast of dynamite that Rodriguez had stolen from the fort's own ammunition stores, while warriors armed with captured military weapons poured through breaches in the perimeter wall that Esperanza's intelligence had identified as vulnerable. The chaos that followed exceeded everyone's expectations as soldiers trained for fighting disorganized bands of native raiders found themselves facing a coordinated military operation that combined traditional Navajo tactics with insider knowledge of their own defenses. Guard towers fell to precisely aimed rifle fire, while smoke bombs created confusion that masked the movement of infiltration teams toward their assigned objectives. Esperanza's approach to Thornfield's quarters required her to cross the parade ground where the execution ceremony was supposed to begin, a journey made infinitely more difficult by the labor contractions that were now coming at regular intervals. Each wave of pain threatened to double her over, but she forced herself to continue moving through the smoke and gunfire toward her target. The confrontation with Colonel Thornfield took place in his private office, where he was frantically trying to organize a defense against attackers whose identity and objectives he still didn't fully understand. When Esperanza appeared in his doorway, her condition obvious despite the military equipment she carried, his face showed the shock of a man who suddenly understood how completely he had underestimated his enemies. "You," he said, reaching for the pistol on his desk while his eyes took in her advanced pregnancy and the determination in her expression. "You're the spy who's been feeding information to the savages. I should have recognized the signs earlier, should have trusted my instincts about that widow story." The conversation that followed was brief but significant. A final accounting between someone who had dedicated her life to protecting innocent people and someone who had built his career on destroying them. Esperanza's words carried the moral authority of someone who had witnessed the consequences of evil and chosen to oppose it regardless of personal cost. "Your campaign of extermination ends today," she said, her voice steady despite the pain that was making it difficult to remain standing. "The documents I copied from your files have been distributed to newspapers in Denver and Washington. And the Eastern businessmen who financed your operations are about to face very public questions about their involvement in genocide. The gunshot that ended Colonel Thornfield's life echoed across the parade ground at the same moment that Hastien Bentley was freed from his shackles by the rescue team that had fought its way to the guardhouse. But for Esperanza, the sound was accompanied by another wave of labor contraction so intense that she collapsed to her knees, understanding that her child was determined to be born in the midst of the battle that had freed its father. The birth that followed took place in Thornfield's office, while the battle for Fort Wingate continued to rage outside, with Ned Lee serving as midwife and Hastien providing protection against any soldiers who might try to interfere with the sacred process of bringing new life into the world. The baby's first cries mixed with the sounds of gunfire and shouting voices, a voice of hope emerging from a moment of terrible violence. When the fighting finally ended and the fort had been secured by the combined force of Navajo warriors and their military allies, Esperanza held her newborn daughter while Hastien knelt beside them both, tears streaming down his face as he understood that their family had been born in the crucible of their struggle for justice and freedom. She will never know a world where her people are hunted like animals, Hastien said, touching his daughter's tiny hand with infinite gentleness. The documents you gathered, the network you built, the sacrifice you made today, all of it has ensured that she will grow up free. But even as they celebrated the successful rescue and the birth of their child, news was arriving that would complicate their victory and force them to make new choices about their future together. The territorial government was mobilizing additional military forces to respond to the assault on Fort Wingate, and federal marshals were already en route to investigate the circumstances that had led to such a devastating defeat of American military power. The morning sun cast golden light across the sacred valley of Canyon de Chelly as Esperanza held her 3-month-old daughter against her chest, watching Hastien and the tribal elders prepare for a ceremony that would formally unite two worlds that had been at war for generations. The ancient red sandstone walls seemed to glow with approval as representatives from both Navajo and Spanish communities gathered to witness something unprecedented in the bloody history of the American Southwest. The victory at Fort Wingate had changed everything, not just for the immediate participants, but for the entire balance of power in the territorial conflict. The documents that Esperanza had stolen from Colonel Thornfield's quarters had been published in newspapers across the nation, exposing the corruption and greed that had motivated the extermination campaign and triggering congressional investigations that reached the highest levels of government. Railroad executives found themselves testifying before Senate committees about their role in financing genocide, while territorial judges faced federal indictments for their participation in the conspiracy to steal native lands. The Eastern business interests that had seen the Southwest as empty territory waiting to be developed suddenly discovered that their investments had become political liabilities that threatened to destroy their reputations and their fortunes. But the most significant change had occurred within the Navajo people themselves, where the successful rescue of Hastien Bentley and the defeat of their most dangerous enemy had created a sense of unity and confidence that transcended traditional clan boundaries. Young warriors who had grown up hearing stories of inevitable defeat now spoke of building a future where their children could live with dignity and security. The baby in Esperanza's arms represented the physical embodiment of that future. A child whose mixed heritage made her a living symbol of the possibility for peace between peoples who had been taught to see each other as natural enemies. Little Ayana, whose name meant eternal blossom in the Navajo language, had been born at the moment when violence gave way to justice, and her presence seemed to inspire hope in everyone who looked upon her. She has her mother's eyes, but her father's spirit, observed Ned Lee, the ancient medicine woman who had become Ayana's informal grandmother and spiritual guide. This child will grow up to build bridges between worlds that have been separate for too long. But Such work requires wisdom and strength that must be carefully cultivated from the earliest age. The ceremony being prepared in the canyon was itself a bridge between traditions, combining elements of Navajo marriage customs with Catholic wedding rituals in a way that honored both cultural heritages without compromising the integrity of either. Father Francisco Morales had traveled from his mission church to participate in the blessing, while traditional Navajo singers would perform the songs that had sanctified unions between men and women for countless generations. The political implications of the marriage were as significant as its personal meaning, creating formal kinship ties between Esperanza's extended Spanish colonial family and Haitian's clan network that could serve as a foundation for broader peace negotiations. Territorial officials who had previously dismissed all native peoples as obstacles to development now found themselves dealing with a resistance movement that included influential Spanish families and dissident military officers. The old ways of thinking about this conflict are ending, explained Samuel Rodriguez, a territorial legislator who had become an ally of the resistance movement after his own son was killed in one of Thornfield's massacres. When respected Spanish families are intermarrying with Navajo leaders, when military officers are testifying about corruption in their own ranks, when newspapers are publishing evidence of corporate conspiracy to commit genocide, the political landscape changes completely. The negotiations that had been taking place for weeks in various locations across the territory were producing agreements that would have been unimaginable before the Fort Wingate operation. Instead of the complete relocation and cultural destruction that had been the stated policy of the territorial government, new proposals called for the establishment of permanent Navajo lands where traditional ways of life would be protected by federal law. More importantly, the intelligence network that Esperanza had helped create was being transformed into a permanent organization dedicated to monitoring and preventing future atrocities against indigenous peoples. The alliance between native communities and sympathetic whites had proven so effective in opposing the extermination campaign that it was being expanded to address other forms of injustice throughout the Southwest. What we have created here goes beyond the immediate conflict, Sergeant Rodriguez explained during one of the planning sessions for the new organization. We have proven that people of different races and cultures can work together effectively when they share common values and common enemies. That model could be applied to other struggles for justice and human dignity, but the path to lasting peace was not without its complications and dangers. Federal authorities were still pursuing some of the participants in the Fort Wingate operation, while diehard advocates of the extermination policy were organizing their own resistance to the changing political climate. Death threats had been made against Esperanza and Haitian, and several of their allies had been targeted for assassination by extremist groups. The most serious challenge came from within the Catholic Church itself, where conservative bishops were demanding that Esperanza be formally excommunicated for abandoning her religious vows and marrying outside the faith. The scandal of a nun bearing a child and fighting in military operations had created a crisis that reached the highest levels of the church hierarchy. They are calling you a heretic and a traitor to your sacred commitments, Father Morales informed Esperanza during one of their private conversations about the ecclesiastical investigation. There are those who would prefer to see you condemned as a warning to other religious women who might be tempted to place human love above divine service. Esperanza's response revealed how completely her understanding of religious duty had been transformed by her experiences with injustice and oppression. The faith that had once confined her within mission walls had evolved into something that demanded active engagement with the world's suffering and a willingness to sacrifice everything in service of protecting innocent life. If serving God means standing by while children are murdered and families are destroyed, then I choose heresy, she said with quiet conviction. If defending the innocent and fighting against genocide violates church law, then those laws serve evil rather than good. I will face whatever judgment comes, But I will not repent of choosing love over law when law had become the enemy of justice. The ceremony that would unite her life permanently with Hastians took place at sunset, when the canyon walls reflected the golden light in a way that made the entire valley seem to glow with divine approval. Representatives from dozens of Navajo clans had gathered alongside Spanish colonial families and sympathetic Anglo settlers, creating a congregation that represented the emerging multicultural society of the New Southwest. Esperanza wore wedding dress that combined Spanish colonial elegance with traditional Navajo jewelry, turquoise and silver ornaments that had been gifts from Hastian's female relatives who had formally adopted her into their clan. The baby Ayana was dressed in tiny traditional garments that had been woven specifically for the ceremony, marking her acceptance into the extended family network that would shape her identity before the holy people and before this gathering of witnesses. Hastian said during the exchange of vows, speaking in a mixture of Navajo and Spanish that honored both their cultural backgrounds. I promise to protect and cherish this woman who has risked everything for love and justice. I promise to raise our daughter to honor both sides of her heritage while serving the cause of peace between all peoples. Esperanza's own vows were spoken in Spanish but translated immediately into Navajo, so that everyone present could understand the full depth of her commitment. Her words carried the weight of someone who had traveled far from her original understanding of devotion and service to discover something deeper and more meaningful. I promise to stand beside this man through whatever trials await us, to raise our daughter with knowledge of both cultures that shaped her existence, and to continue fighting for a world where love is stronger than hatred and justice is more powerful than greed. This marriage is not just the union of two individuals, but the beginning of a new way of thinking about community and belonging. The celebration that followed the ceremony lasted 3 days and included traditional Navajo dancing, Spanish colonial music, and shared meals that featured foods from all the cultures represented in the gathering. Children played together without regard to racial or cultural boundaries, while adults discussed plans for cooperative farming, trading partnerships, and educational programs that would prepare the next generation for life in a multicultural society. But even in the midst of celebration, practical considerations demanded attention. The new family would need a permanent home that provided security from their enemies, while allowing them to continue their work for justice and reconciliation. After extensive discussion with clan leaders and territorial officials, they chose a location in the Chusca Mountains where traditional Navajo grazing areas bordered Spanish colonial settlements. The house they built there was itself a symbol of cultural fusion, combining Navajo architectural principles with Spanish colonial construction techniques to create something entirely new. Adobe walls provided protection from the harsh climate, while traditional Navajo orientation ensured harmony with the natural landscape. Spanish colonial woodworking created beautiful interior details, while Navajo weavings provided color and warmth. This is what the future looks like, observed Governor Samuel Wallace during his official visit to the new settlement that was growing around Esperanza and Hastian's home. Not the complete domination of one culture over another, but the creative fusion of different traditions to create something stronger and more beautiful than what existed before. The intelligence network that had been so crucial during the Phi Shu military conflict was transformed into a peacetime organization dedicated to monitoring civil rights violations and providing legal assistance to members of minority communities. Esperanza found herself serving as a bridge between different worlds, her unique background allowing her to understand and translate between cultures that had previously been unable to communicate effectively. Her work took on new dimensions as Ayana grew from infant to toddler, teaching her daughter to navigate multiple cultural identities while maintaining a strong sense of personal integrity. The child showed early signs of inheriting both her parents' intelligence and their commitment to justice, often serving as a translator between visiting Spanish officials and Navajo elders who were negotiating various agreements. She understands things that adults struggle to comprehend, marveled one territorial judge who had come to discuss land rights issues. When I explain legal concepts in English, she translates them into both Spanish and Navajo in ways that preserve the essential meaning while making them accessible to people with very different cultural backgrounds. The educational programs that Esperanza established drew students from throughout the region, creating the first truly integrated schools in the territorial Southwest. Children learned mathematics and literature alongside traditional Native American knowledge of astronomy and natural science, while studying both Catholic theology and Navajo spiritual traditions as different approaches to understanding the sacred dimensions of existence. What you are doing here challenges every assumption about education and cultural identity, wrote a visiting professor from Harvard University who had come to study the experimental programs. These children are learning to think beyond the boundaries that have traditionally separated different peoples, preparing them to solve problems that have defeated previous generations. But perhaps the most significant legacy of Esperanza and Haitian's union was the model it provided for other couples who wanted to cross cultural boundaries in pursuit of love and understanding. Intermarriage between Spanish and Navajo families became increasingly common, creating a new generation of mixed heritage children who served as natural ambassadors between their different ancestral communities. The political changes that resulted from the Fort Wingate operation and its aftermath eventually reached the federal level, where new policies emphasized negotiation and mutual respect rather than military conquest and cultural destruction. The congressional investigations had revealed such extensive corruption in the previous approach that public opinion shifted decisively toward more humane treatment of indigenous peoples. The old policy of extermination has been revealed as both morally wrong and practically counterproductive, declared Senator Charles Sumner during the congressional debates that established new federal guidelines for Indian affairs. The evidence presented by Mrs. Benally and her associates proves that cooperation and mutual respect produce better results than violence and oppression. Years later, when historians looked back on the transformation of the American Southwest, from a region torn by racial conflict to one characterized by multicultural cooperation, they identified the moment when a pregnant nun chose love over law as the turning point that made everything else possible. Esperanza's journey from the cloistered walls of Mission San Rafael to her wedding ceremony in Canyon de Chelly had changed not just her own life, but the fundamental trajectory of an entire region's development. As the sun set over the Chuska Mountains on the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Esperanza and Haitian stood together, watching their daughter play with other children whose parents represented the full spectrum of Southwestern cultures. The sight filled them both with satisfaction and hope, knowing that they had helped create a world where their child could grow up proud of her complex heritage and confident in her ability to build bridges between different peoples. "We have given her something precious," Haitian said, his arm around Esperanza's shoulders as they watched Iana demonstrate traditional Navajo weaving techniques to a group of fascinated Spanish colonial children. "We have given her the knowledge that love is stronger than fear, that justice is worth fighting for, and that different cultures can enrich each other rather than destroying each other." Esperanza nodded, her hand resting on her belly where another child grew, a sibling who would be born into a world fundamentally different from the one that had existed when she first fled Mission San Rafael. The struggles and sacrifices that had brought them to this moment had been worth enduring, because they had resulted in something that would benefit not just their own family, but generations of children who would inherit a more just and compassionate society. The story that had begun with a desperate flight into the desert had become a testament to the power of love to transform even the most seemingly hopeless circumstances. From the ashes of genocidal violence had emerged a new model for human cooperation, proof that the courage to choose love over fear could change the world in ways that seemed impossible from the perspective of those trapped within cycles of hatred and revenge. standing together in the gathering twilight, surrounded by the evidence of what they had helped create. Esperanza and Hastian understood that their love story had become something larger than themselves, a living demonstration that the barriers between different peoples were not insurmountable walls, but temporary obstacles that could be overcome by those willing to risk everything in service of a more perfect future.
Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.